Okay, before we move over and start to solder, have a look at these. We'll see they are virtually identical, but look at the bottom of the battery polarity. You'll see that one says NPN silicon, but we're actually going to use germanium on that as well. And on the backs, the circuit traces are the same basically. Now you'll notice on both of these boards, let's take this one, that it says things like R1, R2, R3, R4, Q1, Q2 for transistors, C for capacitor, R is a resistor, and then we've got our potentiometers here, input jack, output jack, battery clips, and then these are for mounting it into the case if we want to. We can bolt it in. We can do what we want with it. We could use standoffs on these and get the controls to hold the circuit board in place. We're not going to worry about that for now. We're just going to get the components in place and then test it. So, what do these mean? So if we go back and look at our diagram here, you'll see that I have now labelled. So C1 is this input capacitor. And if we look on the circuit board here, we will find C1 is there and C2 is there. Well, what's C2? C2 is this capacitor here in this circuit. So the other thing we're going to have to be aware of is the polarity of these capacitors. This is a positive ground, so the positive side is towards the ground. The positive side is on that side. And if we look at one of those capacitors, as we've talked about previously, you'll see that it has a negative side and a positive side. So there'll be a different way around in each of these boards. So for example, in this board, which is the PNP germanium version, see it says plus there. The long leg is a plus. So I'm going to make sure that I solder it in with the negative stripe on the negative side. But when I'm making this NPN version, look at where the plus is now. It's on the other side. So I want to make sure again that the long leg is on that side, but the stripe will be pointing the other way. And that's because of our reversed battery causing that. So now we're going to take these over to the soldering station and we're going to solder them together. So here's the soldering station with that mat I was talking about that tells me resistor codes and stuff. Here is my PCB soldering stand, which just holds a circuit board like this. You can adjust it for bigger circuit boards. You can see we've got the PNP one in there. We've got some helping hands here as well. These are brilliant for soldering jacks and audio stuff like XLR cables and stuff together. I've got my magnifying glass here if I need it with some more helping hands on. I'll move that out of the way for a second because I don't need it. Here is my soldering station with both a soldering iron, which is temperature controlled, and a hot air gun as well. This is for surface mount components, also for heat shrink tubing. There I have my safety glasses and also my fume extractor, very important with solder, especially as I believe that solder is lead based. That is a desoldering tool. It looks like this. And when you press this, it provides a vacuum and heat as well, and just takes the solder out of a circuit. It's a much faster way of desoldering than using one of those desoldering pump things. So what I'm going to do now is probably do a time lapse of soldering this together. I'm going to start with the components that are closest to the circuit board, which will be the resistors. Then I'm going to put in that capacitor, and I'm going to put in the bigger capacitors, and I'll probably leave the transistors until the end because I'll be well practiced by then, and I don't want to heat them up too much because you can damage them by doing that. So I'm just going to set this up and do a time lapse of putting the components in these two boards. Before I start doing that, let's have a quick chat about some things that are useful. Always have your diagram with you. I sometimes like to cross off the components that I've soldered in already, so I've got that here to refer to. I'm just going to take the components off the breadboard. Sometimes you might want to leave your stuff breadboarded and put in new components into here, but it's up to you the way you do that. Let's put the other circuit board out of the way for a second. And also I've got some snips to snip off the long legs that are going to go through. What I'm going to do once my soldering iron is warmed up is I'm going to show you how to solder the first couple of components. Okay, soldering iron's warmed up now, and I've got the first R1. This is 33K resistor. I can always check against the color code here. Orange, orange, orange. There you go. You can. It's probably not going to focus on it. There you go. Orange, orange, orange. So that's 3, 3, and the orange is 1,000. So 33,000. That's 33K. And that's what we want in our R1 slot. So here's our R1 slot. Now I would say if you are at all unsure about doing this, get yourself one of these. Before you put the component in its slot, measure it. It will tell you if it's 33K or not. So I often do this myself when I get more complex builds. Should be around 33K with that error adjusting. There you go, 32.32. So it's within spec. Get it in the slots here. And then I'm just going to do this one first. What I'd ordinarily do is probably populate all of them and then solder them together. But I'm just going to do one and then I'll switch over to time-lapse mode and do the rest. So I'll turn this over and I would bend the legs out slightly to hold it in place. Now, what I also find really useful when soldering is some blue tack, because if you've got components that you think are going to slip, you could just put a blob of blue tack on the background, in the background. You just put a blob of blue tack there like that, and it holds the component in as well. Also acts a little bit like a heatsink. So what I'm going to do here is I'll bring this in as well so you can see. I'm going to wipe the soldering iron. I'm going to make sure the tip of my soldering iron is extremely shiny. If the tip of your soldering iron is not shiny, then it's no good. You need to recondition the tip or put a new tip on it. So the first thing that we do is and I'm going to do this with the fume extractor off just so you can hear me for a second. I will turn it on when I go into time-lapse mode. So I'm just tinning the tip and then I'm going to wipe it in this copper wool. Some people use a wet sponge to do this. I don't like the thermal shock that causes to the tip of the soldering iron, so I use this copper sponge instead. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my solder. Now I'm going to heat the joint, not the solder, and I'm going to apply the solder to it. I'm going to do the exact same thing here. And now I'm going to inspect my work. I'm going to take it out of the stand and just have a look under the light. What I'm looking for is I'm making sure that these are not round, so they've got to look like kind of little volcano cones, and I'm making sure that they're shiny so I don't have a cold solder joint. Once I'm happy with that, I can take these legs off, and I usually just save these in case I need to put a jumper in. So that's my first component soldered into the board. I'm going to turn on my fume extractor at this point. Take that blue tack off. Oh, still a bit on the resistor there. There we go. So I'm going to turn on my fume extractor and I'm going to go into time-lapse mode and finish this off. Now, I'll just turn the fume extractor off for a second so you can hear me. I just wanted to cut in here to point out a couple of things. First of all, I held up these with blue tack again because they're quite big and they tend to drop through the board if you don't do that with these electrolytic capacitors. Here, I don't know if you can see it, you might be able to see it better on this board. Remember we talked about the plus symbol here. Well, if you look, there's a square and a round pad. And usually the square corresponds to the plus. And you'll see here, you might have noticed when I was soldering, that's the square pad on that one. So they're slightly different as well. Square pad on that one's there, square pad on that one's there. So you can tell from this side of the board as well that the polarity matters. Be careful of that though. Not everybody uses that square on the plus side. Some people use it on the negative side. So just think about a little bit about what you're doing when you're doing it. So I'm getting there with this now. I've got all of the main passive components in, 3 capacitors, 4 resistors. And now it's time to very carefully solder in the transistors.